So I'm going to start with, how do we involve the consumer in the transition to clean energy? Who wants to jump in?
We were just having this conversation, so maybe I can volunteer you.
I'll second that motion.
Well, so I kind of looked through the lens of actually electric vehicles, but there are a number of creative ways, I think, to engage the consumer, and some of them are financial ways, like pricing dynamics that can encourage people to be more efficient. Also, over the long term, adopt technologies like renewable energy. There are other creative ways, I think, and we were just discussing this. Something that I've heard of late that has become quite a buzzword is this issue of gamification of energy use, actually creating sort of a competitive playing field between consumers who can share their information and basically compete with one another on how much energy they save, how many solar panels they put on their roof. Because a lot of what we've seen, some of the research that we've done shows that some of the decisions that are made at the consumer level and residential level are actually driven by peers and wanting to, I guess, look like an early adopter amongst your peers.
I'll say, if I could say it in one word, it would be feedback. I actually think one of the most brilliant things about the Toyota Prius,
I did not pay him to say that.
He did not pay me to say this, is the fact that it's got a readout right there that tells you what your fuel economy is. It tells you every adjustment to your gas pedal, it tells you the impact of that on your vehicle mileage. You take that to an extreme, and if you give the consumer feedback, they can make educated decisions and they can make educated choices. Think about your electric bill. You have no idea what's driving that electric bill. A lot of you probably don't even look at it. If you have that feedback, and there are a lot of ways it's being provided right now, you can make those educated and informed decisions about your energy consumption. You can know what's driving it. You can understand, geez, when I take these long showers, that's what's causing my electric bill to go up and to go through the roof. So feedback is very important, and I think I'll save the remainder about social media, maybe to a later discussion if you think that'll come up.
So let's talk about feedback for a minute, because anybody who reads...
Can I be a dissenting voice first?
Oh, fine. Okay, go ahead, Jaycie.
So feedback and information only go so far. I mean, even with gamification and hypermilers when hybrids first came out, it only goes beyond a niche if there are economic benefits to the consumer. So I drive a Prius, not surprising. I'm not an eco driver. I know how to eco drive, accelerate gradually, brake gradually, don't put the air conditioner on all the time. But it has such a minimal effect on my gas mileage that it's not worth it to me. Like, I don't want to change my behavior enough because that's a pain in the butt to drive like that versus the benefit. And so I think ultimately there has to be an economic incentive, not just information and feedback.
Well, because that was the question I was going to raise. I don't know how many people saw the recent study of what consumers do and don't do. There's some areas where consumers have a lot of information, like, fuel-efficient cars save fuel. This is good. But then a lot of people don't use that information, and because other things are higher priority for them. So what does it take for people to cross the mental divide to make changes that have an impact?
I might respond to that just a little bit. We're already starting with we had a fun lunch discussion. This is going to be a blast. I think the economic and the financial incentive it's there. It's the savings can be achieved if you know how to achieve them. I mean, where I work, I do a lot of energy efficiency potential studies, and we could make a haircut on our energy consumption in buildings in this country by about 30% using technologies that pay for themselves. They pay for themselves. One of the reasons they don't happen is people have no idea that they pay for themselves. They're not aware of that fact. We've also done studies that would actually measure the impact of behavioral change programs. We've got PhD statisticians and economists that actually measure pre and post what happens when you give a consumer feedback on their energy bill as to what is driving it. And we can statistically measure reductions that have nothing to do with anything other than the fact that they've been given the information to make intelligent choices. So.
But to my knowledge...
So yeah, there's a limit? Yeah, sure, there's a limit to it. But can it get you somewhere? Absolutely.
Oh, I agree, it can get you somewhere. But if you're talking the difference between 40 mpg and 50 mpg, that's not worth the pain in the butt of driving eco. So I think it can only get you so far with a certain audience, but also get you so far in terms of benefit.
Well, let's use that to transition to another question, which was, where are the biggest energy opportunities in this country, say?
I think like Corey was alluding to, I think buildings is probably the first opportunity. And buildings use about 40% of energy use in America.
36%, yeah.
Just with existing technologies, we can cut that considerably. I think there was a report that ACEEE put out that existing technologies available to consumers today could cut energy use by 20%, and that's not even accounting for efficient design and other common efficiency measures.
Yeah, and I'd say that number is pretty much right on the mark. And you'd see that range from anywhere from 15 to 25%, but it's in that range. And one of the barriers is just really awareness and people understanding that you can make a small investment and get a big payback for it.
What about gas prices? I don't know if I can get peak oil and natural gas into the same question, but thinking maybe particularly about natural gas, with the price plummeting, kind of a counter incentive to do things, what role does natural gas play in our energy future?
I'll jump on now if nobody else would like to. A lot of people argue that, hey, natural gas is great because it's got a lower carbon intensity than coal. Absolutely true. It does have a lower carbon intensity than coal. And if we could replace all of our coal generation of electricity with natural gas, that would be a boon. It would be a dramatic improvement from an emissions perspective. However, we have to be really careful about thinking that natural gas is a panacea, because a world run on natural gas is also not going to get us anywhere near where we need to be in terms of carbon emissions. We need to get to zero carbon solutions. So I actually just read a study and a report out of MIT not too long ago that talks about how climate change and its interaction with natural gas. And one of the detriments of thinking that natural gas is this panacea is that it removes the incentive and the ability, and it competes with things like solar PV and completely carbon-free energy. So it can actually delay the introduction of those technologies, which is where we need to be in the long run, because we're focused on this short-term solution that's a little bit better, but it's still not where we need to be.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes like this shiny object and everybody's running towards it right now, and that is the concern that it'll prevent people from investing in renewables. I think another thing, and people talk about fracking a lot, fracking can be done safely, but the problem is that there isn't really a nationwide standard for fracking natural gas. I mean, some of these operations are kind of like mom and pop operations where there's not a whole lot of oversight. So when you look at things like methane leakage, that can actually cause very big problems from an emissions standpoint and a climate change standpoint. But I mean, certainly I think it's better than coal, of course.
I think I can tie it to peak oil for you.
Oh, please, get us back to peak oil.
So I agree that it's not a zero solution, and perhaps it's not the end game, but I think it does buy us time. Just as, just greater efficiency in, for example, conventional vehicles. It's not the end game, but it buys us a pretty good amount of time, because there are going to be supply shortages, not supply shortages, but demands that exceed supply. There will be increasing price volatility. So it does, but I agree, it competes on a price basis for renewable energy and renewable technologies, and we can solve that with incentives or rebates. So that can be solved, but I think they can coexist. And one can be, so I guess the answer is maybe a bridge if zero is your goal.
So Ben mentioned the bright, shiny object phenomenon, which I think is, with all due respect, basically our energy policy at the moment. And I'm curious, given that we don't have a federal policy that's really driving in a particular direction, where is the drive for change coming from?
That was my favorite topic. That's one of my 4 bullets, if you'd like me to kick that off. Before I do that, can I have one more comment on the
Sure.
peak oil
Yeah.
thing? I used to be really concerned about peak oil. I think while it hasn't, some would argue we may be about there. Some would argue maybe it's 10 or 20 or 30 years away. I would argue that if we're focused on that, we're kind of missing the point. I'm not so much, frankly, worried about is there enough stuff in the ground that we can burn. Because, frankly, if we burn everything that's in the ground, we're sunk. We can't just burn everything that's in the ground. If we did that and you did the math on carbon emissions and where that puts our atmosphere in terms of CO2, it's game over. So we can't, I don't think we need to worry about so much as to whether or not the resource will be there. We need to worry about how do we move off of it, because every time we use a fossil fuel, we're sticking carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and we're turning up the thermostat on our Earth. So that's why I'm not as concerned about peak oil anymore. One, if you wanted to be a contrarian, could even argue that that might kind of light a fire for some action, is if prices start going up. We might actually start thinking about efficient alternatives if prices were to start to rise a lot, because oftentimes that's what makes people do it. So anyway, sorry, that was a...
No, I think that's good. Anybody else want to say anything further on that? So talk to me about how is change happening?
Okay. And one of the things I think is interesting, you can really get pretty despondent if you think about the lack of action at the federal level. But there are a few things that are happening at the federal level, and I don't want to discount those. I mean, right or wrong, we had a discussion about CAFE standards today and whether or not it's the most efficient mechanism. I don't think they are, but that's corporate average fuel economy for those who aren't familiar with it. They are increasing that over time, so our fleet should get more efficient. We can talk later about whether or not that's the best approach. We're seeing new lighting standards come in at the federal level, which will take a big cut in terms of our overall lighting consumption. And you're starting to see the Environmental Protection Agency actually regulate carbon emissions from new power plants, which is the first time anything like that has ever happened. The EPA is starting to take action on carbon dioxide. All that said, is any of that enough? Not even close. But where you can get excited is the fact that there's a whole lot happening without anything having to do with the federal government. There are half the states in this country have what we'll call a renewable portfolio standard. They're mandating that a certain percentage of energy come from zero carbon resources by a particular year. One of the most aggressive, for instance, is California, mandating that 33% of energy come from zero carbon sources, from renewable sources, by the year 2020. Pretty tall order. You see a lot of those around the country. You also see about half the states have something called energy efficiency standards, which is similar to a mandated renewable energy, but actually saying that a certain percentage of your energy needs to be reduced over time. In other words, you have to achieve a 20% reduction in energy consumption over the next 10 to 20 years by encouraging efficient buildings, by encouraging efficient motors and lighting and everything else. So the two of those things are all being done by states, which is, a much more local phenomenon and something that maybe, you and I can get our hands around and maybe even have some influence over, and not have to wait for, our completely dysfunctional Congress to do something about it, because don't hold your breath on that. So.
So it sounds like you're saying, though, so why is change happening, or what is creating change? It's being forced, that these are being mandated, so it's being forced.
Right now, yeah, that's about what's causing it.
We'll talk about in the transportation industry, you guys who are working on transportation.
Right.
What's happening there?
So doing a business for a car company and also living in California and sort of living and working a lot of these issues. For example, there's the zero-emission vehicle mandate in California. It's gone through various iterations over the years, but it basically at its core says a certain percentage of car company sales have to be zero emission. So that's either a battery electric vehicle or a fuel cell vehicle. But the other side of that is that they can mandate, the flip side is they can mandate supply, but they can't mandate demand. And there's where you get into problems. So we could build them, but that if they're not price competitive, the market will not come. And so there is a limit to what mandates can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, it's been interesting to see sort of the efforts that come out of cities like Boulder, for instance, or Portland, or even somewhere like the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. You see a great deal of commitment coming from the mayor's office. You have more and more sustainability directors being hired across the country, and the work that they're doing is they're very committed to what they're doing. And from the electric vehicle side, I mean, many of the cities that we work with, it's about 25 right now. have mandated, or not mandated, but they have established clear goals for how many electric vehicles they hope to incentivize, the adoption of which they hope to incentivize, the infrastructure they plan to put in place, things of that nature. I see a lot of movement at the city level.
I want to follow up on what Jaycie said, because she's absolutely right. There's only a limit. You can't force the demand. You can't mandate the demand, and that's an issue and an argument, and I think a very legitimate one from the automotive industry, that forced fuel economy standards are maybe not the best way to go. We tend to, in this country, have two polar opposite approaches to problems. We have a tendency to, everybody wants gas prices to be as cheap as possible, and there are all kinds of policies to try to keep it cheap as possible, and when it goes up to $4 a gallon, everybody is screaming. And at the same time, everybody wants more clean energy, they want, higher fuel economy vehicles and everything, and they want to use less gas. All right, well, those are polar opposites. If you want to use less gas, if you want to emit less, then don't try to make it cheaper at the same time. It's absolutely the opposite of what you would want to do. You'd want to make it more expensive. You want to actually charge a higher price. That doesn't mean it has to be, something that is burdensome to anybody. It could just mean a complete shift of how we tax, what we tax, and how we view energy. You tax the things that you want to disincentivize. Income. Do I want to disincentivize or disincent you from making money? No, I don't. So why would I want to tax that and penalize you for making money when I don't want you to use energy? I want you to use less. Well, let's tax that and tax income less. Let's have it all balance out, but actually, make the things that are kind of bad in our eyes more expensive to try to shift behavior. Because then all of a sudden, people would be clamoring for fuel-efficient vehicles, and I'm sure Toyota would be, do a bang-up job making them. But to try to make them both fuel efficient and have gas prices low, it's just like it's just banging your head against a wall.
Yeah. Let's come back to the vehicle question specifically. What have we learned from the advent of the electric cars that are out on the road so far?
Well, it's, from my perspective, some of the negative press that they receive is due to some of the automakers making very bold projections as far as sales. And that does not include Toyota, actually. But making these very bold projections of we're going to sell this many electric vehicles, and you're talking about a technology that is not necessarily new. It's been around for over a century, but as far as mass market electric vehicles, an entirely new industry. And the education or the understanding of that technology is extremely low around the country. I've seen a couple different focus groups that really drive that home. On the flip side, if you look at when the Prius was introduced to, I know this gets thrown around some, but when Prius was introduced to US 2000, they sold, I think, 5,600 cars. Both the Volt and the Leaf outsold those, respectively. And the Volt is doing fairly well, and the plug-in Prius, only being on the market for 3 months, is doing very well and on track to beat those numbers. So I think that there are some challenges, but there are definitely some upsides to what we're seeing. It's just, we're talking about, we're going to be in the early adopter phase for a while now.
I would completely agree with all of that. So on the first thing you said was that, there's not a lot, or one of the things you said was there's just not a lot of understanding out there, and this is absolutely true. And so part of that has been because it was sold as the new shiny object, the answer, and so it's not the answer. It's a potential part of the solution set, but you have to tell people the realities of different weather is going to change your electric range, and you have to develop a new habit of plugging in every night, and you need a dedicated circuit, or this might this transformer might go, or this circuit. And so there's a lot of just realities and things that consumers need to know in order to live with one of these vehicles. It's very different from just my car is something I don't have to think about other than when I purchase it, but and clean it twice a year. But to have to think about your driving and, okay, what's the weather today? And my electric range might not be 100, it might only be 50. So part of that is because it's been sold as the thing or the answer without giving the other side of it of what is the reality. And then I think another aspect is, okay, so if automakers are being forced to sell these, or that's the mandate, you know, they have to produce these, they're not going to come out and say, all right, we're producing it, but so. So there's a sort of a negative, you know, circle in that, okay, well, we have to produce it, so we're going to produce it, and we're not going to say it's not that great. We are going to say it's great. I mean, there are different degrees to which you can say it's great. You can say, thank you, Ben, for saying that. We try to give the other side of the thing too, which is it is great, but or it's good, but.
Yeah, can you all kind of expound on how are we going to have to relate differently, both to our cars and to energy in homes and businesses? I mean, Jaycie used the term that she doesn't like of paradigm shift, but it's probably true. We can't think about energy in the same way if we're going to make such a massive shift in how we use it. And if you could work in the driverless car to your answer, that would be just stellar.
Well, I will just continue on the car example. People will need to think about their energy use, meaning whether it, just people don't think about energy in a car; they think about gasoline, and so electricity it's an energy carrier, and so part of it's just education. They'll need to be more informed, better educated about what the technology is, what the energy requirements are, and then, as I said, probably making some behavioral changes as well. And okay, now I've got to think more about my driving than I might have needed to in the past if I want to drive one of these vehicles. So it's a pretty significant shift, I think. I wasn't stellar, and I didn't work in the driverless car.
Well, I also think that there is something that's a little more intangible about these cars that I'm talking about the benefits of them. A lot of times when we go to these conferences, people talk about, look, gas prices need to get to this level, or people need to start thinking about, how many miles a day they drive, or people just don't understand that over 90% of people in the U.S. drive less than 40 miles a day, and they should know that, and then they would buy an electric car. But there's something, if you actually drive one of these more than 2 minutes, if you spend some time behind the wheel of an electric vehicle, you realize that there is this sort of, this kind of cool factor involved. And you know what I'm talking about. You've driven one. Just the feeling of that, sort of the battery power is quite different. I have a much older car, and I was able to GM lent us a Volt for a week to try out, and it was just, when we sent it back, I was heartbroken because just the feeling. And I'm not a car person either, and I've really, to be honest, I could care less about cars. I probably shouldn't say that right now, but I've never really been really into vehicle performance, but that was something that definitely hit home.
Let's pick up on that because, yes, in my short experience driving the plug-in Prius, the cool thing was, I want to get all the way to here before my 14 miles of electric power runs out. And it became a little bit of a game and a beat the system, and I was really disappointed when I couldn't do it. How do we use that, this different way of engaging in a way that draws people in?
So, part of it's this idea that Ben talked about of gamification and social influence. Whether that's a benefit or touting rights or bragging rights, or whether it's a negative of just comparison with the group. So part of it's that just comparing against other people. As Corey said, I'm in Los Angeles Department of Water and Power's district, and they did start sending us bills that say, here's what you use versus your people in your neighborhood. And so if you're like, wow, my electricity is twice what this zip code is doing, I must be doing something wrong.
It is true, though, that, and we touched on this earlier, that I think that only goes but so far in really increasing adoption. Those are the gamification things and competing with your peers, I think, are certainly sort of in the realm of early adopters right now, and we'll see if it continues beyond that. But.
Well, Jaycie would probably hate to hear me say this, but I would be afraid of a world that had 7 billion vehicles in it. I think where it can be very myopic here in this country, where everybody drives a car. Well, there are reasons for that. We have built entire cities around the vehicle. We pave everything. We put parking in everywhere. We make big, wide highways. We try to make it easy for cars. If somebody from another planet were looking down on this vehicle, they would think that cars ran the earth. but it's the other way. That's not the case. So I think that in this country we need to start giving serious consideration as to, frankly, is the automobile a long-term sustainable solution for transportation, and is that a model that we want the rest of the world to follow? I've seen pictures of 100 or hundreds of people riding their bikes down the street in China, and the little caption at the bottom of it is, "What if all these people were driving a car?" And it just is a little bit frightening. Well, that's huge amount of energy that's going to that, huge amount of emissions, whether it's an electric car or not. And I just don't think that that's long-term a sustainable path for the other vast majority of people on this planet that don't have the luxuries that we have of driving vehicles around all over the place. So something to think about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, certainly vehicles are not the answer. Electric vehicles are not the answer. I mean, we think about China and India and the rate at which they're starting to buy vehicles, it gets a little scary in the long term. I think here in the U.S. and obviously in Europe, it's already doing this. We need to get smarter on public transit. Also, other ways to, I think, discourage driving, or at least kind of manage driving. In San Francisco, for instance, they're piloting, or they have in place dynamic pricing for parking. And this is something that I think that Boulder could actually consider as they try to adopt more green measures, but having sort of supply and demand model for parking spaces. Why have a flat rate in the center of the city, or why have the same rate in the center of the city as you do on the outside? Or why not find ways to encourage other ways through pricing mechanisms to encourage the use of public transit?
Which gets back to political will.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I can answer. I have an answer that also includes the driverless car. A lot of the driverless car technologies. One of the benefits of that technology is that it's more easy to share a vehicle, and so you don't need a one-person to one-car model. So that's sort of part and parcel to a lot of the. It's not just everybody replaces their conventional vehicle with a driverless car. It's that driverless cars, along with many other benefits, they also enable more efficient sharing of the vehicle.
Why?
Because they're managed, their routes are managed, it's optimized. So right now, vehicles are not optimized. You drive them to work, they sit there for whatever, 8, 10 hours, and then drive. So that's not, if you just look at system optimization, if you just think of driving as a system, that's not a very efficient way of using a car. But if you're able to plan that and route it, it's easier with a vehicle that's automated and can be managed by a central operator, if you will.
And there was a question, is that actually a reality? I think the driverless component might take longer, but this concept of connected cars, I think is definitely a reality. Of cars that are sort of aware of one another. Like, let's say there's an accident a quarter of a mile up the road, the car knows instantly. It'll start braking. We already starting to see that with vehicles today, but those kinds of things can not only have safety benefits, but also benefits for congestion.
Temporary benefits for congestion. I guess I'll argue that. And here's why I argue that is I studied a lot of system dynamics in grad school, and one of the great examples that they love to bring up was, as soon as you make something easier, more people will want to do it. As soon as I make it easier to drive on a road, well, people maybe say, well, all right, I was taking the bus in, but it's pretty easy to zip down the highway now, so you have this balancing feedback that more people now are going to want to go drive because you introduced some fancy technology that made it easier for them to do so. So while you might reduce congestion in the short run, in the long run, it's just going to fill right back up again because it's an easier mode of transportation. So,
good point.
Let's get some more of the questions that were stewing in the audience that haven't been answered. Who's got a question? Yes, in the back there.
There was a great point made in an earlier session about connecting personal health with sustainable energy. Have you guys thought about that connection? Can you articulate it in some way?
The question is the relationship between personal health and sustainability, and how does that relate to this topic?
So I'm trying to think of what the corollary would be. How do you connect energy use to sustainability?
Well, I'll give you an example.
No, I like it.
I drive a Prius. Thank I looked at a volt, but I started doing some research, and I looked at the electromagnetic radiation of the volt, and it was about 3 times higher than that of Prius sitting on the driver's seat. So I was trying to assess, well, I really want a 100% electric vehicle, and I ended up opting for the Prius, which is my second Prius, because I thought it was healthier for me. But I think what was said in the earlier one is ultimately a healthy planet is going to lead to a healthier individual. But I don't hear that connection when I hear about hybrid electric vehicles. I don't hear the health connection at all.
Could people hear that, or do you need a summary? Summary? Okay. Wow. So he chose, first of all, to buy a Prius rather than a Volt because of the lower EMF, electromagnetic radiation in the driver's seat. But then secondly, asking this question of not hearing this relationship between health and sustainability in the discussion around energy. Is that good enough?
I think it's a very good thing to bring up, but I would take it one step further. I wouldn't necessarily say that for health reasons you ought to be driving a hybrid. I would take it the step further, which is for health reasons you ought not be driving. And we ought to be designing cities that are much more walkable and designing cities that are friendly to bicycles. I mean, there's a reason this country has one of the highest incidences of obesity in the world. And that's because we've automated everything. We've made everything easy for people, and so nobody gets any exercise. So I would take it, I think that's a very good point, and I think this group is a perfect type of a group to try to drive that message home, which is, you want to be healthy, well, don't drive a car. And press your people in your cities to design cities and or encourage bike lanes and encourage mass transit and encourage walkability and all those things to try to make you more healthy and get out of the car.
Okay, you marketing people out there, how would you get this message out? Yes?
I work for Holland Recycle, and
Yay.
One
Woohoo.
of the great ways we're doing exactly that, resource sharing and encouraging people to get on bikes and get out of their cars. So, anytime you can advocate for that kind of system, get in your community, that's a great way to.
So Boulder B-Cycle is using, are you using the health message?
We are, yeah. And one of the things we found that was really interesting, we met with Boulder County Public Health, and they've set their 3 priorities for which health issues they're going to be addressing, one of which is obesity, and underneath that, their strategy for addressing obesity in Boulder County is active transportation. And so they're really looking at that as a solution.
So active transportation as a strategy for addressing obesity. That's an interesting connection. Did you guys have other stuff to add?
I mean, I'm in full agreement. I think smart growth is critical. But, I don't think that cars are going anywhere anytime soon. We can do things like, for instance, let's look at school districts. Maybe we can find ways to encourage bicycle sharing for students to get to school. Because otherwise, by and large, you've got diesel-powered school buses, driving kids around the United States, and kids are about the height of a tailpipe, and so you look at the technology, or you look at powertrains, and you look at technological solutions. I do think there is room to start talking about, maybe natural gas school buses or electrified school buses, or at least hybrid school buses. And I know that people are doing that, but sometimes the technological fixes are important.
Hi, Bill. Go right ahead. Give your question.
Can we switch the topic real quick to something bigger picture, which is, look, whose responsibility is it? Is it always the consumer's responsibility to decide between this lesser of 2 evils, or is it the manufacturer's responsibility?
Is it the consumer's responsibility to decide between the lesser of 2 evils or the manufacturer's responsibility?
If you give me too many options, then I'm confused and I choose the one that seems to work for me. If you give me fewer options that are better, then I have no choices to make. They're better.
Fewer, better options. What do you think, Ms. Manufacturer?
I mean, as long as we live in a capitalist country, which we do, and I'm going to say the consumer, if the two choices, one was lesser evil and one was more evil, cost exactly the same, or let me put it the other way, the value to the manufacturer was exactly the same, then perhaps you might think it's the manufacturer's responsibility. But manufacturers make what people want, what people buy.
I don't buy that. I think they make what they want to make and sell it for the price they want to sell it for, and they give us so many choices that we're confused and we're in vertigo all the time. I mean, how do we decide? You know, you go to a grocery store, there's so many products. You go to a car lot, there's so many cars. How many choices do we need?
Well, but those choices come about because people are demanding different things, and manufacturers need to differentiate themselves.
Are people demanding lots of choices, or are they just simply inured to the fact that there are lots of choices?
Well, when I think about electric vehicles, for instance, I think about that there aren't many choices. People ask, why aren't people buying enough electric vehicles? And there are like 3 or 4 models on the road. Why there are only 3 or 4 models on the road is because automakers are a bit hesitant to go out and produce, for instance, Chevy is hesitant to go out and produce 5 different models of electric vehicles with different levels of range. And they won't do that until there is a strong market signal or maybe there's a policy signal.
All right. I think this is a really difficult question, and I was sitting here stewing on it, and how I'd like to answer it is, whether I'm a manufacturer or I'm a consumer, we're all on the same planet. And these problems, whether it's what the manufacturer produced or what it's the consumer bought, we're on the same planet, and it doesn't really matter. I think the answer is both. I mean, absolutely both need to feel a sense of responsibility for trying to do what is necessary for long-term sustainability. I think that means consumers need to start wising up and demanding that manufacturers produce X or Y or Z, and at the same time, manufacturers need to recognize the fact that maybe they're putting out a product that is not good for you, that's not good for the planet, that's not good for future generations, and maybe they should start thinking about some other way, some other long-term solution. I mean, an analogy would be the tobacco industry. You could ask the same question about smoking. Who's responsible for smoking? Is it the person who smokes or the one who makes the cigarettes? Well, I think it's both. The person who's making the cigarettes is profiting from your lack of health and your poor choices, and they're profiting from that, and at the same time, you're making lousy decisions by choosing to smoke. So I think it's actually both. I don't think it's just so simple to point to the automobile manufacturers and say they're evil, or to point to the consumers and say that they're stupid. I think it's a collective effort that we need to recognize we're all in this together. It's not their fault, it's not their fault, it's all of our faults.
This is something that I've been thinking about recently, though, because I've gone to a couple conferences, and somebody brings up the really good question, and this might be an electric vehicle conference. Somebody bring on the panels to ask the audience to raise their hand who is an electric vehicle. And we're talking about electric vehicle advocates, people who work only in this space in the crowd, and there might be a handful out of 100. It's like people, I think there is a problem with the consumers that they're just waiting for it to just happen, and they won't make many sacrifices. It's like, think about how many people buy cars, and I'm sorry to stick with cars, but think about how many people buy cars that are well out of their price range, that lease like very expensive Mercedes that they can't afford, people that are just nowhere near that income bracket. And then you have people that say there's absolutely no way that electric vehicles could succeed. And then I look at something like solar. There are a number of markets in the U.S. where getting very close to, even without subsidies, solar makes sense at a retail level for rooftop solar. So, I mean, you can call up Solar City today, and they can work out a pretty good deal with you for a long-term 20-year lease for solar, and it'll save you energy today. But a lot of people just don't. They just don't make the sacrifice.
I don't think it's necessarily a sacrifice. I just think it's not being able to take the long view. And this is another thing we were having the conversation of yes, if you look at, for example, a vehicle over its complete lifetime, 15, 14, 17 years, absolutely makes sense to buy fuel economy or efficiency. But if I'm looking at it on a 3 or 5 year horizon, I'm going to make a very different choice. Same thing with manufacturers. If they're taking a long-term view, then eventually they will know that energy resources are going to dwindle. We can't have 9 billion cars on the road. So therefore, I need to be thinking that the end game is me as a mobility company, not me as a car maker.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does take some big shift in thinking because, again, going back to this morning's discussion about there's only 14% of the population who are really true Lohas consumers who are taking the long view, and that's not changed much in the last 10 years. There's a huge population that has to be addressed in some different way. Let's see if we can grab another question. Did you still have your question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually curious to hear what you guys have to say about the diesel market or the lack of the diesel market in this economy compared to other countries with very, very small fraction and a lot of consumers still have the perception that diesel is dirty. And however, there's biodiesel slowly they're not coming out, but your choices are very limited. And speaking as someone who owns a diesel Volkswagen Jetta, I do 50 miles per gallon, which far surpasses any gas car. Is up to par with Prius, and the longevity of my engine is probably 2.5 times what I get from a Prius. And then to think about a Prius and the carbon impact that creates in that realm compared to an actual car. I mean, there are so many factors in this that I just don't understand why diesel doesn't have a stronger presence.
So why doesn't diesel have a stronger presence in the U.S. in particular?
I mean, a big reason is just the difference in policy. I mean, it's the predominant powertrain in Europe because there are strong price incentives to the consumer, both on the vehicle side and the fuel side, and strong disincentives for gasoline vehicles. So that's a huge part of it. And so once you get this sort of critical mass, and that's what there is sufficient demand, then you do have the supply. So I think that's a big part of it in the U.S. is that Europe has looked at more GHG emissions, whereas the U.S. has looked at more criteria, or they focus more on criteria pollutants versus GHG emissions.
Yeah, my understanding was it had a lot to do with which pollutants are regulated.
Right.
In
or
the
which
US
pollutant is the
another
priority, or which emission is the priority.
Yeah.
And since we only have 2 minutes and 35 seconds left, and I haven't gotten to make this
Is there
point, I want to
something
go
you'd
ahead
like
and
to
make
say,
I would
Corey?
like
Yeah.
to make it. And I do think it's a good segue from the diesel question. And when I just hear about it, I can't get excited about diesel, even though you're absolutely right. Everything you said is absolutely right. I can't get excited about it because where do we need to be in 40 years? Where we need to be in 40 years from a climate change perspective is globally, we need to have reduced our carbon emissions globally, everybody, India, China, the world, United States, by 80% relative to where we are today. That means that the industrialized nations, the ones who are already emitting out the wazoo, it's probably closer to like 90%. So I'm talking about a 90% reduction in carbon emissions. So none of those solutions, the Prius doesn't get us there, the diesel, the Volkswagen Jetta diesel doesn't get us there. It's got to be an absolute assault on energy consumption and carbon emissions in this country over the next 40 years to have a prayer of keeping temperatures anywhere in a reasonable level for your kids and your grandkids. So we need to start thinking long term. We can't think about the short term. We've got to think long term and how do we get there. And these incremental solutions, you almost got to leapfrog right past.
So how do we do that? All right. How do we do that? I mean, how do we really turn our brains around to think that way when that's not the way we seem to be wired?
I wish I had all those answers. If I did, I'd probably sleep a lot better at night.
I think we need a benevolent dictator, pretty much.
Benevolent
That's the only way it's gonna
dictator.
happen.
Any volunteers? Let's take one last question.
2 days last week, Germany produced over 50% of its energy from solar sources, equivalent to 20 power grids. And I asked him, but he was a specialist in that field, how that happened. And he said, very intensive mandates over a 20-year period, forcing the entire country to shift as much as it's sustainable. And I think one of my things that I was thinking about is people are fundamentally selfish at the end of the day. And it's going to take a benevolent dictator or a centralized governmental mechanism to actually impose on the dictator that they want.
So he's talking about Germany and the way that they have actually really pushed solar well beyond what a cloudy country like that should be able to do. In my personal opinion, having
But
lived
he
there.
said the other key word, which is sustained over 20 years. And that's
Yeah.
the reason Brazil has ethanol. These are sustained policies, sustained mandates, sustained subsidies on the demand side. We have 2-year political cycles in this country, so and lack of an energy policy, how are we going to make 20-year decisions, 50-year decisions, or 100-year decisions?
I was looking at something recently, a couple days ago, some report that showed the level of subsidies for oil and coal at the sort of beginning of the oil industry, for instance, and significant subsidies for the first 15 years. A lot of them just stayed, like some of the tax breaks that they get and the credits that they get for extraction of oil never actually were phased out. So it's a bit frustrating when you hear all the kind of political punditry and the noise about subsidies for renewables. Like, why can't they just compete on their own? And until they're able to do that, we won't support them. It's ridiculous when you understand the level of subsidies other industries have received.
We're at the end of our time. Any last words from the panelists that would send our audience off to the ice cream social feeling excited?
I just want to know why we're having ice cream before wine. That just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know, Corey Welch for Benevolent Dictator?
I'll say one thing, maybe is on a positive note. I mean, at least for me, I think it's great that, it's great that groups like you guys get together at all. I mean, I know for me, and some of you guys are probably in the same boat, this stuff can get you down if you think about it too much. But it's when you get together with people like you who care about it, who are energetic about it, who have bright ideas about it, it kind of keeps you going, and it helps you think about, all right, maybe we really can, make this happen. Maybe all is not lost. So I think it's, you keep networking, you keep talking to like minds, and you keep coming up with ideas, and you don't give up hope.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you all for being here. And we'll see you over at Rembrandt.